So I made that video you just saw entirely in Blender, and I wanted to give a little look behind the scenes into how it was made and talk about some of the things I learned along the way and what I would do differently if I had to do it all over again. Just to be clear, this isn't meant to be a tutorial. It's just me talking about a project I worked on to give you some insight as to how it was done in case you want to try something similar on your own. My main motivation for this project was to work on something that I could use to improve my visual storytelling. Most of my work thus far has consisted of single subjects that don't move, so I wanted to try expanding beyond that. So, my first goal was to create a scene with complementary pieces to support whatever my main subject was. If I had all the time in the world, I might have modeled a full-blown bar or a distillery, but to keep things simple, I settled on having a barrel as a table prop, a tumbler, and some ice. It's not much, but it's enough for me to have other things I can cut to for B-roll. That way, you're not just seeing 7 different angles of the same object like in my keyboard video. Secondly, I wanted to create more visual interest in my scenes through motion, which is how I ended up playing with Blender's fluid simulation for the pouring shots. I also messed around with moving the lights and had a small rigid body sim for the falling ice. Thinking about how to frame shots in motion required a different sort of thought process than I'm used to since everything I've made thus far didn't move. That was a fun way to work my brain and step outside my usual thought process of just finding one decent angle to render and post on Instagram. The models in this project aren't very complex. Everything except the ice started as a cylinder that I then loop cut, scaled, and extruded around. I slapped a reference image in the background to help get the basic shape down that I then fine-tuned to my liking. Something I did before I started though was look up dimensions for everything so my objects would all have the correct proportions to one another and I wouldn't have to guess if something was too big or too small. For the ice, I subdivided a cube and pushed around some vertices in sculpt mode to give it its shape. I have to credit Wenbo for this idea and I'll link his modeling tutorial in the description. For the materials, I'm only going to focus on the ice and the label since those are the most interesting. Wenbo's tutorial provides a clever way to texture the ice. He uses a noise texture as a bump map to create subtle surface imperfections, giving it the semi-cloudy look that ice tends to have. He also mixes a transparency shader using ray depth as a factor. According to the Blender docs, ray depth is the number of times a ray of light bounces around on the surface. So if I understand the setup correctly, the parts of the ice that has a lot of light interacting with it will appear more transparent. The effect is subtle, but it helps make the ice look like it's interacting with the surrounding environment more. The label is something I made in Photoshop. I made the base diffuse layer, and from that I recolored a grayscale version of it for a roughness map and made a black and white version to use as a mask. Then I went to Blender and made this giant mess. It looks complicated, but really all I'm doing is mixing a bunch of noise textures together to make the label look less flat. This section here is responsible for the paper texture. I'm mixing 2 different noise sizes to give the paper some variation. Then I took that and mixed it with the black and white mask I made so the texture doesn't show up on the printed parts of the label before feeding all of that into a bump map. This raises the printed text and gives the paper a bumpy look. This section uses noise to texture the print itself. I wanted to sprinkle in some shiny sparkles into the print, so this map determines where the bright spots are going to be. This inverts it and mixes it with the roughness map so the bright spots appear more glossy. With those in place, I played with the anisotropy and the sheen to affect how the light wraps around the label. Speaking of lighting, this project was the toughest thing I had to light to date. Working with hyper-reflective and transparent surfaces introduced all sorts of problems I didn't have to deal with before. I spent about 25 hours just working on the lighting alone and I still didn't figure everything out. I could talk about this for hours, but here's a consolidated version of what I experimented with and figured out. Normally, when I set up my lights in Blender, I would start by adding an area light and point it at my subject. But in this case, my subjects are super reflective, so pointing a light directly at it produces a hotspot. When I add more lights to fill in the shadows or create highlights, I get all of these extra visual blemishes. One way to get around this is to make use of bounce lighting, which is something that is often done in real-world photography. Instead of having another light source, I can add a white plane to reflect light that's being casted off into the void back onto my subject, increasing the total amount of light in the scene without creating another hotspot. I can disable the plane's visibility along with the shadow it casts, so I can position it freely without having to worry about it sneaking into my render. You're not just limited to using planes to bounce light, by the way. When I was setting up this test shot, I encompassed everything in a cylinder because I felt like the whole scene was too dark. Thus brightened everything up nice and evenly, and I can control the brightness by scaling the cylinder. Now, sometimes I wanted a light pointing directly at the bottle because I wanted to create a highlight. The problem is that the light reflection is very sharp. In real-world photography, you would add a diffuser to your light to soften the edges, but Blender doesn't have a way to do that natively. To get around that, I created an emission plane with a gradient to fake the diffusion I want. Now, the lighting appears much softer around the edges, and I can control the way the falloff looks by manipulating the gradient. While this is a nice solution, it didn't solve all of my problems. I had volumetric scattering in the scene because I really wanted to emphasize the directional lighting coming from the spotlights. The light in the back works out okay, but the lights in front are still casting sharp reflections. I couldn't figure out how to get a cone of light from an emission plane to diffuse the edges, and I couldn't reposition the lights while maintaining the look I wanted, so I just decided to live with it. Something I learned after I rendered everything out was that you could disable the light's glossy ray visibility to get rid of those reflections. Disabling the light's multiple importance might work as well, but I've had mixed results while playing with it, and I don't fully understand what else gets affected when it's turned off. Either way, I now have a couple more options in my toolkit to explore the next time I run into this problem. The last thing I want to talk about is the fluid simulation. I don't have too much to say here since this was the first time I ever played with the fluid sim in Blender. However, if I could go back in time to talk to myself before I started this project, I would have two pieces of advice for me. First, play around with all of the settings when trying to achieve the look you're going for. When I first set up my fluid sims, they looked a little bit chunky, so my natural instinct was to increase the resolution to smooth things out. I ended up with high resolution sims that took hours to bake that only looked marginally better. What I should have been messing around with were the mesh settings instead. If I hadn't been so fixated on just the resolution alone, I could have saved myself a ton of time and electricity by reading the Blender docs to figure out what the different settings do and how I could combine them to achieve the result I want. And don't forget, you can play around with the environment itself. Changing the size of the emitter, where it's located, and what you're funneling the liquid through can all drastically change the final result. Secondly, I need to set aside way more time to experiment with the settings. How good the sim looks is directly proportionate to the amount of time spent fine-tuning the options. The more you play around, the more likely you are to run into an unexpected result that looks way better than you could have possibly imagined. And don't rush the process by changing multiple things at once before baking out a preview. You might think you're saving time because you'll be baking less, but you'll also have a harder time identifying which setting needs to be adjusted to fix any problems. And that about wraps things up. If you have any thoughts or feedback about any of what I've covered, feel free to let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.